Everyone assumes there's one Rick smarter than the rest. Fans rank them constantly, argue about it, crown a favorite. The show itself seems to back that up, over and over. But the Citadel's own governing council never once managed to pick a winner. And that is exactly why, in this video, we break down how smart every version of Rick really is. Section 1. Rick C-137, the Rick we actually follow. For years, the show built its entire world around one basic idea. There was a Rick, there was a Morty, and they lived their lives together in a place fans called Dimension C-137. That number got repeated constantly, in fan discussions, in wiki pages, in casual conversation about the show. People pointed at the crumbling, monster-filled version of Earth from the first handful of episodes and said, "This is C-137, this is where our characters started." Morty himself, sitting inside his own story, believed the same thing. For a long stretch of the series, nobody watching had any reason to think otherwise. Then the show pulled the floor out from under that idea, and it did so slowly, piece by piece, across several seasons, instead of dropping it all at once. That slow unwinding is worth walking through carefully, because the confusion around who this Rick actually is says a lot about how the show handles identity, memory, and intelligence all at the same time. Before anyone can compare how smart different Ricks are against each other, there needs to be total clarity about which Rick is even being talked about when someone says the main one, the one the cameras follow every week. That clarity did not exist for a long time, not even inside the story itself. The reveal that finally cleared things up came in Season 6, in the episode Solarix. That episode confirmed something that reshaped how every earlier season needed to be understood. The reality shown in the very first episodes of the show, the one everyone had been calling C-137 for years, was never actually C-137 at all. That world has its own separate identity. It is called the Prime Dimension, sometimes referred to as the Cronenberg Dimension because of what happens to it early on. Unlike most of the other realities in the show, which get a proper number and letter code, the Prime Dimension never receives one, even though it gets explored more than almost any other reality across the whole series. That absence of a label is not a small detail. It marks the Prime Dimension as different from the rest, almost as if the story is treating it as the version everything else gets measured against, without ever officially numbering it like the others. The Morty that viewers have followed since episode 1 actually comes from that Prime Dimension. He is native to it. It is his original home, the place he was born and raised before any of the multiverse hopping started. That single fact rearranges a huge amount of what people assumed they understood about this Morty's background. He was never a random Morty pulled from an unremarkable, forgettable reality. He is tied directly to the dimension that produced the show's ultimate villain, because that same Prime Dimension is also the birthplace of Rick Prime. Rick Prime is not some distant figure who has nothing to do with this particular family. He is the native Rick of that exact dimension. And because Morty comes from that same reality, the connection goes deeper than simply sharing a home planet. Morty is Rick Prime's actual biological grandson. That relationship had been sitting underneath the entire show from the very beginning, completely hidden until Season 6 finally brought it into the light. Every early adventure, every random portal trip, every throwaway joke from the first couple of seasons happened inside a story where the grandson of the show's future arch-enemy was riding along the whole time with absolutely nobody aware of it, including the writers who had not settled on that backstory yet when those episodes first aired. So if the Morty from those early episodes is Rick Prime's real grandson, the obvious question becomes where the Rick actually came from, since clearly the two of them are not naturally from the same place the way a grandfather and grandson living together would normally be. Rick Prime is the native Rick of that world. He is the one who grew up there, who would have been raising that family, if he had not abandoned all of it long before the show even begins. The Rick that the show actually follows, the one doing all the burping and inventing and traveling, comes from somewhere else entirely. His true point of origin is the actual Dimension C-137, a completely different reality from the one everybody had been mislabeling for years. Dimension C-137 is where this Rick was born and where he grew up. It is his real home, in the same sense that the Prime Dimension is Morty's real home. And just like the Prime Dimension carries a tragedy that shapes everything that follows, C-137 carries one too, a tragedy specific to Rick himself rather than to Morty. In C-137, Rick had a wife named Diane. He had a daughter named Beth. This is a different Beth from the one raising Morty and Summer in the show's main timeline, a version of Beth who never got the chance to grow up, get married, or have children of her own. She died as a child in that reality. Because Beth died so young there, no Summer and no Morty were ever born in Dimension C-137. That single fact explains why nobody talks about a C-137 version of the family everyone else already knows. There was no family left to talk about, not in the shape the show usually presents one. The reason Beth and Diane died traces directly back to Rick Prime. At some point, Rick Prime appeared inside this Rick's garage. He came offering something specific, the gift of portal technology, the same kind of interdimensional travel that eventually becomes such a normal part of the show. Rick, the one from C-137, turned him down. He was content with the life he already had. He wanted to stay with his family rather than chase across the multiverse. That single decision, choosing his family over the offer sitting in front of him, becomes the hinge that the rest of his story swings on. Not long after Rick said no, a portal opened inside that same garage. Something came through it, a bomb, and it detonated. Diane and Beth were killed in the blast. Rick himself was wounded, but survived. In the aftermath, once the shock of the moment had passed enough for him to start asking questions, Rick discovered that Rick Prime was behind the attack. The offer, the refusal, and then the bomb were all connected, and Rick Prime was the thread running through every part of it. That discovery set the entire course of this Rick's life going forward. From that point on, he became someone chasing a single goal, tracking down Rick Prime and making him pay for what he had done. Everything else people recognize about this Rick, his coldness, his refusal to get attached to anything, his constant movement from one reality to the next, grows directly out of that one violent afternoon in his garage. He did not start out as a person who treated relationships as disposable. He became that way because the people closest to him were taken from him by another version of himself who wanted something Rick refused to give up. For a long time, though, even this version of events was not the full truth, as far as the audience knew. Earlier in the show, during the events of the Rick Shank Redemption, Rick was captured and interrogated by a character named Cornelius Daniel, who wanted the formula behind Rick's portal gun technology. Under that pressure, Rick gave an account of his past, a story about losing his family and immediately building a portal gun in response. At the time, audiences absorbed that account as the real backstory, since nothing on screen contradicted it yet. Later, in the Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, Rick let Morty look through a brain scan, and that scan confirmed that most of what Rick told his interrogator years earlier was actually true. Almost everything held up. The one important detail that turned out to be different involved timing. Rick did not build the portal gun the instant his family died. Instead, he was rushed away in an ambulance to be treated for the wounds from the explosion. After that, he lived alone for a stretch of time, carrying the weight of what had happened before he was in any state to build anything. Only once he had absorbed the shock and worked through it on his own terms did he finish building the portal gun, driven by his own decision rather than an immediate, uncontrolled reaction. That distinction matters more than it might first appear. The version Rick gave to his interrogator painted him as someone who turned tragedy into invention without missing a beat, almost mechanically. The real version, confirmed through his own memories, shows someone who needed time to recover physically and emotionally before he was capable of doing anything at all. It replaces the image of an unstoppable genius reacting instantly to loss with the image of a wounded man slowly rebuilding himself before he could even think about revenge. Once Rick did finish that portal gun and set out to find Rick Prime, his search eventually led him to settle inside the Prime dimension, the same reality that had been mistaken for C-137 by fans for years. He did not end up there by accident. He went there because it was Rick Prime's home turf, the one place Rick Prime might eventually return to. Staying there gave Rick a reason to hope that, sooner or later, his target would come back, and when he did, Rick would finally get the chance for revenge he had been chasing. This choice explains something that had puzzled longtime viewers even before the full picture was revealed. Why would this particular Rick settle into a family that was not biologically his own, caring for a Morty who was not, strictly speaking, his own grandson by blood in the way most people assumed? The answer sitting underneath the surface the entire time was that he was using that household as bait, a lure meant to draw out the one person responsible for destroying everything he actually cared about. Back in his true home reality, in the real dimension C-137, something else had been happening the entire time Rick was away pursuing his goal. Solarix reveals that Rick had frozen that whole dimension inside a time loop, locking it on the exact day his wife and daughter died. Every person living in C-137 was stuck reliving that day, over and over, for decades, without any escape. Rick had set this up himself, Though he had made one mistake in the process, he never stopped the people trapped inside the loop from aging. So even while they were forced to repeat the same day endlessly, their bodies kept getting older the entire time, year after year. When Rick eventually returned to C-137 during the events of Solarix, he found himself face to face with an artificial version of Diane, built to resemble his dead wife. This creation tormented him, forcing him to confront everything he had buried and avoided for so long. It was not a real resurrection of anyone. It was a construction shaped by his own memories and guilt, something built to look and sound like the person he had lost, standing in front of him as a reminder of exactly what had been taken away. Facing that reminder pushed Rick toward finally letting go of what he had built there. As part of trying to move past everything tied to that day, he got rid of the time loop he had trapped the entire dimension inside. The people of C-137, after decades frozen on one repeating day while still quietly aging the whole time, were finally released from that cycle. After everything that happened during Solarix, an accident with the portal fluid mechanics ended up scattering Rick, Morty, and Jerry each back to their own dimensions of true origin. Rick returned briefly to C-137, the site of his personal tragedy. Morty returned to the Prime Dimension, the place where he was born and where his real grandfather, Rick Prime, had once lived before abandoning everything. Jerry was sent back to wherever his own original reality happened to be. Before vanishing through the portal himself, Rick gave Summer specific instructions on how to guide him back afterward, telling her exactly how to reach him again once he had gone. He asked to be brought back not to C-137 and not to the Prime Dimension, but to a third reality entirely, one identified as Dimension C-131. That detail confirms something important about the family audiences had spent most of the show watching. The household viewers know best, the one built around Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty, as the show has presented them for the majority of its run, is not simply the Prime Dimension household, and it is not C-137 either. It is its own separate reality, C-131, the place Rick chose to return to once the chaos of Solarix had settled. Summer, working together with Beth and Space Beth, lit a beacon that helped guide Rick back through the tangled layers of the multiverse until he made it home to that specific dimension, hoping to resume the life he had built there with the family he had assembled around himself. All of this layered confusion around dimensions and identity connects directly back to how Rick has always described himself. For years, he carried a self-given title, calling himself the Rickest Rick, a phrase that first appears in close Rick counters of the Rick kind. The idea behind that title rests on the belief that he has no real emotional attachments to anyone, that he stands apart from every other version of himself precisely because nothing and nobody can hold him down. That self-image never held up under real scrutiny, even within the same episode where he first claims it. His attachment to Morty was visible from early on, undercutting the detached persona he kept insisting on. Later episodes made that gap even harder to ignore. Rick Mirai, Jack, and Solarix both show a Rick driven by grief, by a decades-long need for revenge, and by an eventual choice to stay with a family he did not have to stay with at all. None of that fits the cold, unattached figure he claims to be. Rick himself seems to understand this contradiction better than anyone. He does not actually believe he is the real Rickest Rick. He reserves that title, in his own mind, for Rick Prime instead. As far as Rick sees it, Rick Prime is the one Rick who genuinely lives without emotional attachment. Someone who embodies that cold philosophy naturally, rather than adopting it as a coping method after tragedy. Rick views his own version of detachment as something forced onto him by circumstances, a mask worn out of necessity, rather than a true reflection of who he really is underneath. Outside analysis of the two characters tends to agree with that self-assessment. Comparisons between the two point out that Rick Prime measures ahead of Rick C-137 across nearly every trait Rick prides himself on, whether that means raw intelligence, careful planning, or sheer determination. Rick spent decades hunting Rick Prime without ever managing to close the distance, and that failure is generally explained by how thoroughly Rick Prime covered his own tracks the entire time, staying just out of reach no matter how hard Rick searched. None of this would make sense without first untangling exactly which Rick has been at the center of the story all along, which dimension he actually comes from, which tragedy shaped him, and which family he chose to settle with once his search for revenge had run its course. Every later comparison between Ricks, every ranking of who counts as smarter or more capable, depends on getting this foundation straight first. The full picture that emerges from Solarix, Rick Murray Jack, and the earlier interrogation scene in the Rick Shank Redemption paints a very different figure than the confident, unstoppable genius the show often presents on the surface. It shows someone shaped by loss, someone who built an entire identity around chasing the one person responsible for that loss, and someone who eventually chose to keep living inside a borrowed family rather than face life completely alone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same man now sits across the multiverse from the one Rick who beat him at almost everything he valued about himself. And getting a clear sense of how smart this Rick truly is means starting with the person who managed to outmaneuver him for decades without ever being caught. Section 2. Rick Prime, the first Rick to crack interdimensional travel. Every villain needs an origin, something that explains how they became the person capable of doing what they eventually do. For most of the show, Rick Prime existed only as a name, a shadow standing behind Rick's grief. Someone talked about far more than he was actually shown. It took years of episodes before the story finally slowed down enough to explain who this figure really was, what he built, and why he became the single most dangerous being in the entire multiverse. Rick Prime is the Rick native to the Prime Dimension, sometimes called the Cronenberg Dimension, the reality first shown in the earliest episodes of the series. Long before any portal travel existed anywhere in the multiverse, Rick Prime lived there with a wife and a daughter, in a life that looked, from the outside, a great deal like the ordinary family setup so many other Ricks eventually built for themselves. He was married to a version of Diane. He had a daughter. He had, in other words, everything that later versions of Rick spend their lives either protecting or running from. At some point, Rick Prime became the first Rick anywhere to figure out how to build working portal technology, developing it entirely on his own without help from any other version of himself. This single breakthrough changed everything about how the multiverse would eventually function. Before Rick Prime cracked interdimensional travel, no Rick anywhere had a way to cross between realities. Once he solved it, the entire idea of countless Ricks meeting each other, comparing notes, forming councils, and building entire cities out of their own shared existence became possible for the first time. Instead of staying home with the family he already had, Rick Prime made a different choice. He left them behind entirely and set out to explore the multiverse, carrying his new invention with him from reality to reality. Wherever he went, he introduced the very same portal technology to other versions of himself, effectively planting the technological seed that all future portal travel across every Rick and Morty story eventually grew from. Every single time some other Rick somewhere builds a portal gun or steps through a shimmering doorway between dimensions, that entire chain of events traces back to the choice Rick Prime made the day he decided his family mattered less to him than what he could discover out in the wider multiverse. This decision to abandon his family rather than stay and raise them is worth sitting with directly, because it draws a hard line between Rick Prime and almost every other version of Rick the show has ever presented. Plenty of other Ricks struggle with attachment. Plenty of them drink too much, push people away, or hide behind sarcasm instead of dealing with their feelings honestly. Rick Prime did something different. He looked at the choice between family and discovery and picked discovery cleanly, without the kind of internal conflict that defines almost every other Rick who ever wrestles with a similar decision. That same willingness to walk away from everything he once had becomes the seed for the show's entire central conflict. Years after leaving his own family behind, Rick Prime appeared inside the garage belonging to a completely different Rick, the one who would eventually become known as Rick C-137. He offered that Rick the same gift he had already spread to countless other versions of himself, the technology needed to travel between dimensions. This particular Rick turned him down. He was happy with his life exactly as it was, with his wife Diane and his young daughter Beth, and he had no interest in giving that up for a doorway into infinite other realities. Rick Prime did not take that rejection well. Soon after the offer was refused, a portal opened inside that same garage, and a bomb came through it, killing Diane and Beth and leaving Rick himself wounded. Rick eventually pieced together that Rick Prime was behind the attack, and that discovery launched him into a lifelong hunt for revenge that would define the rest of his existence. For a long stretch of the show, that single tragedy, the garage, the bomb, the deaths of one specific Diane and one specific Beth, was treated as the full scope of what Rick Prime had done. Audiences understood him as a monster who murdered one family out of spite after being turned down. Season 7 revealed that this understanding barely scratched the surface of what he had actually done. During the events of Unmortrican, it came out that Rick Prime did not stop with the death of C-137's Diane and Beth. He repeated that same pattern of offering portal technology to other Ricks and killing their versions of Diane whenever they turned him down, working his way through reality after reality, family after family. Eventually, rather than continuing to hunt down individual Dianes one at a time across the multiverse, he built something far more devastating, a weapon capable of ending the search permanently. That weapon is what some Ricks call the Omega device, though Rick Prime himself dismisses that name, insisting his creation is too impressive to need a label like that at all. The device works by targeting a single version of a person in one reality and using that single act to erase every other version of that same person across every dimension in existence at once. Kill one Diane with it, and every Diane anywhere, in any timeline, in any corner of the infinite multiverse, disappears along with her, gone permanently rather than simply lost in one specific reality. Rick Prime used exactly this method on Diane. By ending one version of her life with the Omega device, he wiped out every single Diane that had ever existed anywhere across infinity, not just the one connected to Rick C-137's garage. This single detail rewrites an enormous portion of everything the show had already presented up to that point. For years, Rick and Morty crossed through dimension after dimension, meeting endless variants of nearly every character imaginable, yet a version of Diane never once turned up anywhere in all that traveling. Viewers had years to notice that absence without ever getting an explanation for it. Once the Omega device reveal landed, that mystery resolved itself completely. Diane was never simply missing from the realities Rick and Morty happened to visit. She had been erased from the very possibility of existing anywhere at all. The Omega device does more than simply erase a person's physical existence across every reality. It also interferes with the memories other people carry of that person, smoothing over the kind of gap a total, sudden disappearance would normally leave behind. When Rick Prime used the weapon on Slow Mobius, an uncle connected to Rick's extended family, that character's own children lost the ability to remember him afterward, despite having grown up around him their entire lives. In a similar way, both Rick and Beth eventually admit they struggle to hold on to clear memories of Diane, even though she was present for the whole of their lives together before she was erased. The weapon does not simply remove someone, it reaches into the past itself, softening how thoroughly they are missed by the people who loved them. Because of what it is capable of doing, the Omega device stands as the single most powerful and dangerous weapon that has ever appeared anywhere in the show. Nothing else in the entire multiverse comes close to matching its reach. Other weapons kill one version of a person in one reality, leaving countless other versions completely untouched elsewhere. The Omega device erases the entire concept of that person from existence itself, collapsing every timeline's version of them down into nothing all at once. Building something this destructive says a great deal about what kind of mind Rick Prime actually has. Inventing working portal technology from nothing, entirely alone, without guidance from any other Rick, already marks him as exceptionally capable. Following that up decades later with a weapon that can erase a single individual across the entirety of infinite reality, places him in a category almost no other character in the show ever reaches. Rick C-137, the version of Rick most familiar to audiences, spent decades hunting Rick Prime and never managed to catch him, a failure repeatedly explained by how effectively Rick Prime covered his own tracks the entire time he was being hunted. A person capable of staying hidden from another version of himself, someone who shares his exact same intelligence and resourcefulness, for that many years running, is operating on an entirely different level of planning and control. Rick Prime's confidence in his own abilities becomes especially clear during the final confrontation in Unmortrican. Rather than treating Rick C-137 as a real threat worth taking seriously, he approaches the entire fight with open mockery, at one point expressing surprise that the Rick he refers to using a nickname built around his dead wife actually managed to track him down at all. He calls out Rick directly for having used Diane's voice inside his own ship's AI system, treating even that small, personal detail as another opportunity to needle his enemy rather than something worth showing any restraint about. That same overconfidence carries through the rest of the fight in ways that end up costing him everything. Rick Prime brings his enemies directly into his own operational base rather than avoiding the confrontation altogether, seemingly certain that nothing they could do would actually threaten him there. He even shows off pieces of his own weaponry to the people hunting him, treating the entire situation as an opportunity to boast rather than a genuine risk to his safety. That same carelessness eventually gives evil Morty the opening needed to catch him off guard and hold him in place long enough for Rick C-137 to finally get the revenge he had been chasing for decades. Before that final defeat, Rick Prime demonstrates just how far he is willing to go to prove a point about his own detachment from anything resembling love or connection. During the same episode, he uses the Omega device again, this time on Slow Mobius, an uncle figure connected to Rick's family who had barely appeared anywhere else in the show up to that point. Even in the middle of demonstrating this act of total erasure, something in his reaction briefly suggests it costs him something internally, a flicker of sadness crossing his face even as he goes through with it. That small crack in an otherwise cold, controlled performance hints that the persona Rick Prime has built around having no attachments at all might not be quite as complete or effortless as he wants everyone, including himself, to believe. Rick Prime also demonstrates a cruel streak that goes beyond simple violence, choosing to torment Rick psychologically rather than settling for a quick, clean fight. At multiple points, he uses machinery built to resemble Diane against his enemy directly, including a giant robotic construction shaped like her face, using the memory of the person Rick loved most as a weapon rather than simply relying on brute force. This choice reveals something specific about how Rick Prime operates. He does not merely want to defeat the people who oppose him, he wants to break them psychologically first, using whatever personal weakness he can find as the sharpest possible tool available to him. That same instinct shows up again during an earlier confrontation when Rick Prime and several captured Ricks are forced into a tournament-style battle, each one told that the winner will get their own version of Diane back as a reward. The other Ricks, despite direct warnings from Rick C-137 that Rick Prime cannot be trusted, still choose to fight each other for the chance at getting Diane returned to them. As expected, the promise turns out to be a complete lie. Instead of any real reward waiting at the end of that fight, a bomb built to look and sound like Diane is dropped into the room, an act designed purely to torment the survivors rather than deliver anything real. Everything about how Rick Prime operates points toward a mind built entirely around control, manipulation, and long-term planning, rather than one that relies on raw, impulsive violence. He does not simply overpower his enemies through force, he sets traps built specifically around what he knows will hurt them the most, understanding exactly which emotional buttons to press in order to break down anyone standing in front of him. Building a weapon capable of erasing a person across all of infinite reality only works as a threat if the person wielding it also understands with total clarity exactly how much pain that erasure will cause on the other end. Despite all of this planning and control, Rick Prime's story ultimately ends in defeat. After evil Morty manages to hold him in place, Rick C-137 finally gets the chance he had been chasing for decades, beating Rick Prime to death rather than accepting any other outcome, even as Rick Prime continues taunting him right up until the very end. Rather than trying to negotiate, bargain, or find some clever escape the way he had managed for so many years before, Rick Prime meets his death defiant, mocking his killer for having become just as cold and violent as the man he had spent his whole life hunting. That final act closes out the story of the one Rick who managed to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast his exact same counterpart for decades on end, someone who built the very foundation that made interdimensional travel possible for every other Rick that followed him, and someone whose intelligence was matched only by how completely he was willing to weaponize the people he had once loved in order to stay ahead of anyone chasing him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Understanding what Rick Prime built and how he operated sets up a direct comparison worth exploring next, one that moves away from the version of Rick everyone assumes is the smartest and looks instead at the version most other Ricks openly look down on, the one from the Citadel who never quite earned the same reputation for brilliance that Rick Prime carried his entire life. Section 3. The Rickest Rick title and what it actually means. The phrase that ended up defining an entire character for years did not start out as some grand philosophical statement. It began as a throwaway line at the end of a single Season 1 episode, tossed off almost as a joke to smooth over an argument with Morty. That episode, called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, is worth walking through carefully because the moment the title comes from says something very different from what the phrase eventually came to represent once fans picked it up and ran with it for years afterward. Understanding that gap matters more than it might first seem, because so much of how people talk about Rick's intelligence today rests on a phrase that was never meant to carry that kind of weight in the first place. The episode begins with a normal family breakfast getting interrupted the moment a portal opens in the middle of it. Three armed versions of Rick step through, announcing that Rick Sanchez of Earth Dimension C-137 is under arrest, charged with crimes against other Ricks, acting on the authority of a group calling itself the Trans-Dimensional Council of Ricks. Rick has no idea what they are talking about, but he still gets pulled away against his will, taken somewhere he has never been and clearly does not want to be. The suddenness of that opening matters, since it establishes immediately that Rick, for all his supposed control over his own life, can still be caught completely off guard by forces operating outside his own small corner of the multiverse. A man who prides himself on staying several steps ahead of everyone else gets yanked out of his own kitchen without any warning at all. That somewhere turns out to be the Citadel of Ricks, described directly by Rick himself as the secret headquarters belonging to the Council of Ricks. Rick explains the reasoning behind the Citadel's existence to Morty once they arrive. Being as intelligent as he is has made him plenty of enemies across the wider universe, ranging from terrorists to dictators to large parts of the intergalactic government itself. Wherever people in positions of power exist, some of them end up threatened by a mind sharper than their own, and Rick's mind qualifies easily. According to Rick, plenty of other versions of himself, spread across countless different timelines, ran into that exact same problem. Eventually, a large number of them landed on the idea of banding together for protection, gathering by the thousands into one shared, defended location, rather than facing those threats alone. That explanation is worth sitting with for a moment, since it reveals something Rick rarely admits so plainly elsewhere in the show. He is describing, in his own words, why an entire population of geniuses decided that even genius on its own was not enough protection against the dangers that come with standing out. If brilliance alone were sufficient, none of these Ricks would have needed each other. The fact that thousands of them chose collective safety over individual confidence says plenty about how seriously even the smartest version of a person can take the risks that come with being smart in a universe full of people who resent that difference. That shared decision produced the Citadel, a place built specifically to shelter Ricks from exactly the kind of danger that comes with being feared by people in power. Most timelines, Rick explains while giving Morty this tour, come with their own version of Rick, and most of those Ricks come paired with their own version of Morty. Walking through the Citadel means walking past enormous numbers of both, spread out across a location built entirely around housing them safely. The sheer scale of that population deserves attention on its own. This is not a small club of a dozen or so allies. It is a full, functioning society, built entirely from copies of the same two people, stretched across enough space and infrastructure to house what amounts to a small civilization made of nothing but Ricks and Mortys. Rick himself never actually joined this council. That detail matters, because it becomes the reason he ends up the prime suspect once a string of murders targeting other Ricks starts happening across the multiverse. Someone has been killing Ricks, and because Rick never signed on with the group meant to protect its members, the council has an easy person to point fingers at. Rather than agreeing to stand trial and defend himself through whatever official process the council might offer, Rick escapes custody and begins running, determined to prove his innocence on his own terms instead of trusting a system he never wanted to be part of in the first place. That decision alone speaks volumes about how Rick views organized authority in general. Even when his own freedom is on the line, even when cooperating with the council might be the fastest, safest route to clearing his name, he chooses to trust nobody but himself, preferring the uncertainty of a solo escape over the structure of a system built by people who share his exact same mind. While all of this is unfolding, a smaller, quieter storyline runs alongside the main chase. Jerry, largely ignored and unimportant to the main plot the way he often is, ends up spending time with a different version of Rick entirely, one known across the Citadel as Doofus Rick, widely regarded as the kindest Rick out of every version living there. Jerry and this particular Rick end up bonding, something that becomes a small running joke once the main Rick eventually finds out about it. This detail sets up the very next section's focus directly, since Doofus Rick's entire reputation, both his gentleness and the way other Ricks openly look down on him, grows out of exactly this kind of moment. Watching that friendship unfold in the background of a much larger crisis offers a quiet contrast to everything else happening around it. While thousands of Ricks are busy chasing down a suspected murderer, one small, overlooked interaction between a dismissed human and a dismissed Rick manages to slip past almost entirely unnoticed by everyone caught up in the bigger drama. The main plot eventually leads Rick and Morty into the hands of a Rick who appears, on the surface, cold, violent, and clearly dangerous. A figure the episode presents to the audience simply as Evil Rick. This version of Rick captures both of them, intending to have Rick's brain downloaded, a process that would presumably let this villain extract whatever knowledge or advantage he was after. Before that can happen, Morty, working from inside the same base where he and countless other captured Mortys have been imprisoned, organizes those other Mortys into a rebellion. Together, they manage to free Rick and turn the tables on their captors. That rebellion, led entirely by Morty rather than Rick, deserves attention on its own terms. In a story so focused on measuring Rick's intelligence against every other version of himself, it is Morty, the character constantly dismissed as a shield and a tool, who actually organizes the plan that saves both of them. What happens next reframes everything the episode has built up until that point. Once the fighting settles and Soldier Ricks from the Citadel arrive to clean up the aftermath, they discover something nobody had realized during the chaos. The evil Rick responsible for capturing them was never actually acting on his own. He was, underneath everything, a mindless cyborg, a puppet being remotely controlled the entire time by someone else. That someone else turns out to be his own Morty, a character the audience later comes to know as Evil Morty. As the freed Morty prisoners are being led toward refugee ships bound for the Citadel, this particular Morty quietly removes an eye patch he had been wearing. The exact device that had apparently been used to control his own Rick, stomps it into pieces, and slips away into the crowd without anyone noticing who he really was. That single moment, small and easy to miss on a first watch, plants the seed for one of the show's biggest ongoing storylines, years before most viewers had any way of understanding its significance. The audience gets to see the reveal happen. Rick and Morty, the two characters actually living through the episode, never do. They walk away from the entire event believing they simply survived an encounter with a violent, unpredictable version of Rick, with no idea that the real threat behind everything was a Morty capable of manipulating a Rick like a tool. The quiet way this reveal gets handled, tucked into the background of a scene most viewers would naturally focus on for other reasons, mirrors exactly how easily real danger can slip past even the most self-assured, supposedly brilliant characters in this story. Back at the Citadel, once the truth about the murders comes out and Rick's name gets cleared, the Council offers him something almost comically small given everything he just went through, a simple apology paired with a coupon for a free Morty. That kind of thin, bureaucratic gesture fits the tone the episode has been building around the Council the entire time, presenting them as an organization more concerned with paperwork and appearances than with any real accountability. A man wrongly accused of murdering members of his own extended community, chased across dimensions, and nearly killed by a puppet controlled by a hidden villain, receives, in exchange for all of that, a piece of paper and a coupon, treated by the Council as a fully adequate resolution to the entire ordeal. Morty, meanwhile, is still upset with Rick, and that frustration is what actually sets up the phrase this entire section is built around. Earlier in the episode, in a moment separate from the main chase, Rick told Morty the real reason he keeps him around on their adventures. According to Rick, Mortys are useful specifically because they are seen as unintelligent, which makes them act almost like a kind of shield, a blind spot that helps hide Rick from more dangerous authorities who might otherwise be looking for him directly. Hearing that explanation understandably upsets Morty, who wants to feel like more than just a convenient tool built to keep his grandfather safe. Being told directly that his entire value to someone he trusts comes down to being underestimated by outsiders is not the kind of thing most people would take well, and Morty's reaction throughout the rest of the episode reflects exactly that discomfort. As the episode winds down, Morty tries to push Rick towards some kind of emotional honesty about all of this, hoping his grandfather might finally show a little humanity and actually connect with him instead of brushing everything off. Rick refuses outright. Instead of engaging with what Morty is asking for, he turns the moment into a joke, telling Morty that if he wants connection, he should go join one of those clubs all the other Ricks seem to need, the same kind of group Rick himself never wanted any part of. He then adds that maybe the reason he does not connect with people the way Morty wants him to comes down to being the Rickest Rick there is, and that it would only make sense, following that logic, for the Rickest Rick to have the Mortiest Morty riding along with him. That line lands exactly the way Rick intends it to. Morty, despite everything he has just been through and everything he was hoping to hear instead, ends up satisfied by being called the Mortiest Morty, letting go of his frustration simply because Rick handed him a version of the same title he claims for himself. The entire moment works less like a genuine breakthrough in their relationship and more like Rick finding a clever way to end an uncomfortable conversation without actually giving Morty anything real. It is worth noticing just how little Rick actually offers in that exchange. He does not apologize. He does not explain himself further. He does not address the specific hurt Morty raised about being treated as a shield rather than a person. He simply reframes the entire situation around a title he invented on the spot, and that reframing is enough to end the conversation entirely. Understood in its original context, the phrase never described some deep, hard-earned philosophy about detachment or superiority the way later seasons sometimes treat it. It started as a punchline, a quick way for Rick to deflect an emotional conversation he had no interest in having, dressed up just enough to sound meaningful so Morty would drop the subject. The title only picked up the heavier meaning it eventually carries once later seasons, years down the line, started treating it as something Rick genuinely believed about himself, something worth measuring against other Ricks in a serious way rather than as a throwaway joke from a Season 1 episode. Fans latched onto the phrase, repeated it, built entire arguments and rankings around it, and eventually the show itself began treating the title with a weight it never actually carried the moment it was first spoken. That gap between where the phrase came from and what it eventually grew into matters when trying to understand how Rick actually sees his own intelligence. The Citadel itself, the entire reason thousands of Ricks banded together in the first place, exists because being smarter than almost everyone else comes with real danger attached to it. Terrorists, dictators, and government agents all have reason to fear a mind like Rick's, and an entire society of alternate Ricks formed specifically around defending against that fear. Rick refusing to join that same society, choosing instead to face all of that danger completely alone, says something about how he views himself compared to every other version of him hiding safely behind Citadel walls. Whether that choice reflects genuine confidence in his own abilities or something closer to stubborn pride is left for the audience to decide, since the episode never spells out exactly which one is driving him. At the same time, the episode makes it clear that Rick's own read on his intelligence and independence is not always accurate or complete. He walks through this entire story believing he understands exactly what happened to him, only for the audience to learn that the true threat behind it all was a Morty clever enough to manipulate an entire Rick without either Rick or Morty C-137 ever noticing. Being the Rickest Rick, whatever that phrase is meant to capture, clearly did not make this particular Rick sharp enough to catch what was happening directly in front of him. He spends the entire episode operating under the assumption that he is the smartest, most capable person in every room he walks into, and the story quietly proves him wrong without ever making him aware of it. That gap between confidence and actual awareness runs through the episode from beginning to end. Rick presents himself, both to Morty and to the audience, as someone whose intelligence sets him apart from every other version of himself gathered at the Citadel. Yet throughout the very same episode where he makes that claim, he gets arrested for crimes he did not commit, escapes custody rather than trusting a system built by people just as smart as he is, and completely misses the true nature of the villain standing right in front of him. None of that lines up cleanly with the picture of total, unmatched brilliance the title Rickest Rick seems to promise on its surface. If anything, the episode that coined the phrase spends its entire runtime quietly undercutting it, showing a Rick who talks like the smartest person in the multiverse, while repeatedly failing to see what is actually happening around him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What the episode does establish clearly, without question, is the existence of an entire structure built around ranking, organizing, and protecting different versions of Rick, an early glimpse of exactly the kind of system that later parts of the show expand on in much greater detail. Somewhere inside that same Citadel, among the thousands of Ricks living there, exists a version considered by nearly everyone around him to be far less capable than the rest. A Rick gentle enough to befriend someone as overlooked as Jerry, and looked down on by his fellow Ricks, specifically because he does not measure up to whatever standard the rest of them use to judge each other. Section 4. Doofus Rick, the Citadel's least intelligent Rick. Not every Rick in the multiverse gets treated the same way once other versions of himself get a look at him. Somewhere among the thousands of Ricks living inside the Citadel, one particular version stands out for reasons that have nothing to do with cleverness, invention, or ambition. He stands out because he is kind, gentle, and openly mocked by nearly everyone around him for exactly those qualities. That Rick goes by the name Doofus Rick, and his story offers one of the clearest examples in the entire show of how intelligence gets ranked and judged among people who are all, technically, the same person. Doofus Rick's full identity is Richard Daniel Sanchez, originally from Dimension J19ZG7. Right away, this places him as a distinct, separately documented version of Rick, rather than some background joke invented on the spot. He has his own dimension, his own designation, and his own recorded history inside the show's mythology, the same as any other named Rick variant. That level of documentation matters more than it might first seem. A character invented purely as a one-scene punchline would not normally carry a full-dimension code, a complete backstory, and repeated appearances stretched across multiple later episodes. The show clearly treats him as a real, ongoing part of its universe, rather than a disposable gag meant to be forgotten the moment his scene ends. His first appearance comes during Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, the very episode already covered for introducing the phrase Rickest Rick. Doofus Rick shows up there as one among many alternate Ricks pulled into the search for Rick C-137 after he gets falsely accused of murdering other Ricks across the multiverse. In the middle of all that tension and chase, Doofus Rick ends up staying at the Smith family house, and it is there that his defining moment happens, not through anything related to intelligence or invention, but through friendship. Placed against the backdrop of a citywide manhunt, an accused killer on the run, and an entire council scrambling to protect itself, this small domestic subplot could easily have been overshadowed completely. Instead, it ends up carrying real emotional weight of its own, standing apart from everything else happening around it. Doofus Rick approaches Jerry directly, and Jerry, more than perhaps any other human character in the entire show, responds warmly to him. Out of every Rick shown across the whole series, Doofus Rick appears to be the only one who genuinely likes Jerry as a person, treating him with real warmth instead of the constant dismissal Jerry usually receives from his own family. That single detail flips the show's usual dynamic completely. Jerry, so often treated as the least capable, least respected person in his own household, finally finds someone willing to accept him without condition, and that someone happens to be a version of Rick. Considering how often Jerry gets talked over, ignored, or actively insulted by his own wife, his own children, and especially his own father-in-law, the sight of any Rick treating him with basic decency stands out immediately, even before considering how unusual that decency turns out to be within the wider Rick population. The other Ricks around the Citadel notice this friendship forming, and rather than treating it kindly, they belittle Doofus Rick for it. The show presents this reaction plainly, showing Doofus Rick crying in response to how the other Ricks treat him, while Jerry, in a rare moment of him comforting someone else instead of being comforted, offers him support. That role reversal deserves attention on its own terms. Nearly every dynamic Jerry takes part in the show involves him needing comfort, reassurance, or rescue from someone else, usually delivered with visible reluctance. Here, for possibly the only extended stretch in the entire series, Jerry becomes the one offering steady support to somebody else who needs it, and he does so without hesitation or complaint. Jerry ends up preferring Doofus Rick's company so much that he actually suggests Doofus Rick take his own Rick's place in his life, a suggestion that speaks volumes about how differently this particular version of Rick treats the people around him compared to nearly every other Rick anywhere in the multiverse. That suggestion, however lightly it might be phrased in the moment, carries a serious implication underneath it. Jerry is essentially saying that a Rick, widely dismissed as the dumbest, weakest version of the character, treats him better than his own family's celebrated genius ever has. Whatever standard the rest of the Citadel uses to judge Rick variants clearly has nothing to do with how well any given Rick actually treats the people who depend on him. By the end of the episode, Doofus Rick returns one more time, standing outside on a rainy street and simply waving at Jerry from a distance. The main Rick, Rick C-137, happens to notice this small moment, and rather than feeling any sympathy for it, he finds the whole thing amusing enough that he decides to call up other versions of himself, specifically to mock Jerry over the friendship. That reaction says something important about how deeply the show's version of intelligence gets tangled up with cruelty. Being sharp and capable, in the world these Ricks live in, often comes paired with treating warmth and kindness as something worth laughing at rather than respecting. Rather than pausing to consider why Jerry might have connected so easily with someone else, Rick immediately reaches for ridicule, treating the entire moment as material for a joke, rather than as any kind of window into his own shortcomings as a father figure and grandfather. Physically, Doofus Rick looks close enough to the main Rick that the resemblance is immediately obvious, just altered in a handful of specific ways that mark him as different. Where the primary Rick has light blue hair, a unibrow, pale grayish skin, and his familiar white lab coat worn over a blue sweater and brown pants, Doofus Rick shares nearly all of that same base look, but with a distinctive bowl-cut hairstyle, noticeably larger buck teeth, and eyes that tend to drift in different directions from one another rather than focusing together the way most other characters' eyes do. Some fan comparisons have even likened his overall appearance to a severely inbred character from an entirely separate comic book series, a comparison built entirely around how exaggerated and unusual his specific features look compared to the standard Rick template the show usually follows. That visual design choice matters beyond simple comedy. By keeping his features close enough to recognize as unmistakably Rick, while exaggerating just enough to mark him as different, the show visually reinforces the idea that he is the same base person as every other Rick, only altered slightly, the same way his personality represents a variation on the same underlying template, rather than a completely separate kind of character. One detail about his life carries real weight once it gets explained clearly. Doofus Rick never married and never had children of his own, a fact that separates him from the standard setup nearly every other prominent Rick in the show is built around, where a Rick lives connected to a Beth, a Morty, and often a Summer as well. Because he had no biological family of his own to travel with, Doofus Rick ended up being assigned a Morty from an entirely different reality, one where everyone happens to resemble the actor Eric Stoltz from the film Mask. That detail, strange as it sounds on its own, fits neatly into how thoroughly documented and specific this character's background actually is within the show's mythology, rather than existing as some vague, undefined joke character with no real story behind him. Losing out on the standard family structure that defines nearly every other Rick's daily life could easily have left him isolated entirely. Yet the show instead gives him an assigned companion anyway, suggesting that even a version of Rick considered unworthy of respect by his peers still gets folded into whatever system exists to pair Ricks and Mortys together. According to other Ricks, Doofus Rick supposedly comes from a dimension known for a specific, deeply unpleasant detail involving what its population eats, a rumor repeated by other Ricks as one more way to mock him. Doofus Rick himself consistently denies that this rumor is true whenever it comes up, refusing to accept the label other Ricks try to pin on his entire home reality. Whether or not the rumor holds any truth, the fact that it exists and gets repeated so often says something about how little respect other Ricks are willing to extend to him, using even his place of origin as another angle for ridicule. It is worth noting how thoroughly this mockery extends beyond simple jokes about his intelligence. Other Ricks do not just question his mind, they attack his entire background, his home reality, and by extension everyone who might share that home with him, treating an entire dimension as fair game for humiliation, simply because one of its Ricks happens to be gentler than they are comfortable with. Despite constantly being treated as the least intelligent, least respected Rick among his peers, Doofus Rick maintains interests and behaviors that set him apart in a positive light rather than a negative one. He keeps a coin collection built around the character R2-D2, and Jerry stands out as the only person shown accepting this collection without judgment, treating something Doofus Rick clearly cares about as worth respecting rather than mocking. That small detail mirrors the larger pattern running through his entire story. Wherever other characters, especially other Ricks, choose mockery, Jerry consistently chooses acceptance, and the two of them end up building a real connection specifically because of that difference. A small hobby like collecting coins built around a single beloved character might seem unimportant on its own, yet the fact that Jerry bothers to notice it and bothers to treat it kindly reinforces exactly why this particular friendship works so differently from how Doofus Rick gets treated everywhere else in his life. The label Doofus Rick itself comes directly from how other Ricks perceive him. He is described as noticeably less intelligent and less sarcastic than the vast majority of his fellow Ricks, lacking the sharp, biting wit that nearly every other version of Rick shown across the series relies on constantly. Where most Ricks treat sarcasm and cruelty as a kind of default setting, weapons they reach for automatically in nearly every interaction, Doofus Rick instead comes across as sincere, straightforward, and easily hurt by how others treat him. Unlike the vast majority of Ricks, who behave with a coldness bordering on complete disregard for other people's feelings, Doofus Rick is described plainly as kind-hearted, someone polite to everyone he meets rather than someone constantly measuring who deserves his respect and who does not. That single difference in temperament ends up defining his entire reputation more than any actual measurement of his intelligence ever does. That gentleness becomes the exact reason he gets dismissed so thoroughly by his peers. Nothing about his story suggests he lacks basic competence or an inability to function. He clearly gets by well enough to survive inside the Citadel, to maintain his own home dimension, and to care for the Morty assigned to him. What actually earns him the disparaging nickname has far more to do with personality than raw capability. He does not perform intelligence the way other Ricks perform it, does not weaponize wit the way they do, and does not treat kindness as something embarrassing to hide. In a society built entirely around versions of the same brilliant, difficult, often cruel man, choosing warmth over sharpness apparently counts as its own kind of failure. It is a strange, almost backward standard once examined closely. A character who causes no harm, forms genuine bonds, and manages his own life competently still ends up ranked near the bottom of an entire population, simply because he refuses to treat other people the way the rest of that population treats each other. Doofus Rick's story does not end cleanly within the boundaries of a single appearance. He turns up again later, connected to one of the show's larger, more devastating events. During the events of the Rick Shank Rickdemption, an episode where the entire citadel of Ricks gets transported directly into a prison belonging to the Galactic Federation, huge numbers of Ricks end up dying as a result. It remains unconfirmed whether Doofus Rick counts among those lost in that disaster. A picture of him does appear inside a cupboard in Rick's garage during that same episode, glimpsed briefly during an unrelated argument between Summer and Morty, though that detail alone does not settle whether he survived the Citadel's destruction or not. That small, easy-to-miss detail, a photograph tucked away in a cupboard rather than any direct confirmation, leaves his fate genuinely uncertain for a long stretch of the show's ongoing story. A small mystery hiding inside a much larger catastrophe. Even his fate around the events of Rick Mirai Jack, one of the show's biggest mythology episodes later on, stayed unclear for a stretch of time. Eventually, in the episode There's Something About Morty, Doofus Rick shows up again, this time alive and visible on one of the surveillance cameras connected to Evil Morty's Omega device. That appearance confirms, at least as of that point in the story, that he survived everything that came before it, still existing somewhere out in the multiverse long after so many other Ricks around him had already been wiped out. Surviving that long, through multiple catastrophic events that claimed enormous numbers of far more celebrated, far more respected Ricks, is not a small accomplishment for a character so often treated as the weakest, least capable version of himself. Looking at his story from beginning to end, Doofus Rick occupies a strange and specific place inside the show's much larger obsession with ranking intelligence. He is treated, consistently and openly, as the lesser version, the Rick other Ricks feel comfortable laughing at, excluding and belittling. Yet nothing about his actual behavior ever shows him failing at anything important. He survives disasters that kill enormous numbers of far more celebrated Ricks. He maintains a home dimension of his own. He cares for a Morty who did not come to him through any ordinary family connection. And he manages something that almost no other Rick in the entire show consistently pulls off, forming a real, warm, lasting connection with another person, built entirely on kindness rather than usefulness or fear. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That contradiction, a character treated as the dumbest among an entire population of geniuses who nonetheless survives, adapts, and connects with others more successfully than nearly any of the Ricks who mock him, raises a real question worth sitting with directly. If intelligence among Ricks gets measured by cleverness, invention, and cruelty, and Doofus Rick clearly falls short by that standard, then what happens when a completely different version of that exact same character, from a slightly different reality, ends up achieving something almost none of his more respected counterparts ever manage? Section 5. The Doofus Rick variant who cured cancer. The Rick and Morty comic series, published separately from the television show, introduced a second character carrying the same nickname as the Rick covered in the previous section, though this version comes from an entirely different dimension and tells an entirely different story about what that nickname actually means. His appearance shows up in a backup story called Jerry and Rick's Day of Fun, printed inside Rick and Morty issue 10, released by Oni Press in January of 2016. His story takes everything the previous section established about reputation and intelligence and turns it in a completely different direction. This version of the character comes from Dimension J19 Alpha 7, a separate designation from Dimension J19 ZG7, which is where the television show's original Doofus Rick lives. The two share the same general personality type, the same nickname, and roughly the same backstory involving never marrying and never having children, but they are documented as distinct individuals from distinct realities rather than the same character appearing twice. Because this version of Rick never married and never had children of his own, the usual family structure most Ricks are built around does not exist in his home dimension either. There is no Beth, no Summer, and no Morty native to that particular reality. The same absence that defines the original Doofus Rick's home dimension as well. The comic story built around this character focuses on something the television series barely touches: the ongoing, repeated nature of Jerry's friendship with a doofus Rick. Rather than treating their bond as a single moment confined to one episode, the comic presents something more consistent and lasting. According to the story, Jerry realistically continues visiting this particular doofus Rick every month, treating the friendship as an ongoing part of his life rather than something that happened once and then faded away. That detail matters because it takes a relationship the show only hinted at briefly and gives it the kind of continuity a real friendship would actually carry, rather than leaving it behind as a passing joke. Jerry's dedication to this friendship goes further than simply showing up on a regular schedule. He goes out of his way to memorize the official, full name of this doofus Rick, using it correctly rather than settling for the shorthand nickname everyone else defaults to. That small gesture, choosing to use someone's proper name instead of the mocking label other people have stuck them with, mirrors the same respect Jerry showed toward this type of character back in the original episode. Jerry treats this version of Rick as a person worth knowing properly, not as a punchline other people can laugh at from a distance. The story pushes this effort even further by showing Jerry arranging to have a shirt printed specifically to mark their friendship, one carrying the name of the story itself, Jerry and Rick's Day of Fun, printed across it. Giving a friend a shirt made specifically to celebrate spending time together is a small, ordinary gesture, the kind of thing regular people do for each other without any grand meaning attached to it. Coming from Jerry, a character the show usually treats as clumsy and overlooked even by his own family, that same small gesture carries extra weight. It shows him putting genuine thought and effort into a relationship that means something to him, rather than drifting through it the way he drifts through so much of his own life. Doofus Rick's reaction to the shirt reveals just as much about his character as Jerry's gesture does. Rather than treating the gift as silly or beneath him, he responds with open warmth, telling Jerry that the idea is smart and adding that it makes total sense given that Jerry works in advertising. That comment matters for two separate reasons. First, it shows Doofus Rick paying close enough attention to Jerry's actual life and job to reference it accurately, something very few characters in the show ever bother doing for Jerry specifically. Second, it shows him offering genuine praise rather than the sarcasm or dismissiveness that defines how most other Ricks treat nearly everyone around them, including their own family members. The moment that gives this character his defining scene comes immediately afterward, when Doofus Rick casually mentions that, just the previous week, he discovered the cure for cancer within his own dimension. Framed on its own, that single sentence would normally count as one of the single greatest scientific achievements imaginable, something worth international celebration, historic recognition, and endless attention from an entire world grateful for the discovery. Curing cancer represents exactly the kind of achievement most people would call proof of towering intelligence, the sort of accomplishment that could define an entire life's work on its own. Doofus Rick does not treat it that way at all. He delivers the news in the same breath as complimenting Jerry's t-shirt idea, mentioning it almost as an afterthought rather than as the center of the conversation. He follows the announcement by saying, sweetly, that he doubts the feeling of solving something like cancer even compares to the feeling of coming up with a clever slogan for a shirt. That single line reframes the entire scene. A character constantly dismissed by other Ricks as the dumbest among them, mocked openly for lacking the sharp, sarcastic edge that defines nearly every other version of the character, casually accomplishes something almost no other Rick in the entire multiverse has ever shown achieving, and then turns around and says a small act of friendship meant more to him than that accomplishment did. This detail forces a direct reconsideration of everything the earlier section established about how intelligence gets measured among different versions of the same character. The Doofus Rick from the television show earns his nickname because he lacks the biting wit and constant cleverness that defines how other Ricks speak and behave. Nothing about that earlier portrayal ever suggested he was incapable of real achievement, only that he behaved differently from what other Ricks expected a smart person to look like. This comic version confirms that suspicion directly. Somewhere out in the wider multiverse, a version of this same gentle, overlooked character type quietly solved one of the hardest problems humanity has ever faced, all while continuing to prioritize a small, ordinary friendship over any recognition that achievement might have brought him. That contrast raises a real question about what the label Doofus Rick was ever actually measuring in the first place. If intelligence among Ricks gets judged by sarcasm, coldness, and the ability to intimidate or outmaneuver other people, then warmth and kindness will always read as weakness, regardless of what someone quietly accomplishes behind the scenes. This particular doofus Rick never brags about curing cancer, never uses it to elevate his own reputation among other Ricks, and never treats it as more important than the people in his life. Compared to how other Ricks in the show constantly parade their own brilliance, using it to establish dominance over one another and over everyone around them, this quiet, almost bashful reveal stands out as a completely different way of relating to one's own intelligence. It also reframes the earlier mockery doofus Rick receives from his peers in a much harsher light. Other Ricks belittle him for being less sharp, less cynical, and less impressive by their own standards, without ever apparently bothering to find out what he has actually accomplished on his own. A character capable of solving cancer within his own dimension gets treated as the dumbest version of himself simply because he refuses to act the way the rest of them expect a genius to act. That gap between real accomplishment and social reputation exposes something uncomfortable about how the Ricks judge one another throughout the entire show. Attitude and performance seem to matter more to them than actual results, and a gentle, unassuming Rick who solves one of medicine's greatest challenges still ends up treated as beneath the rest simply because he refuses to brag about it. Jerry's role throughout this story deserves attention as well, since his own behavior stands in direct contrast to how the other Ricks treat this character. Jerry never mocks doofus Rick, never questions his intelligence, and never treats their friendship as anything less than genuine. When doofus Rick casually mentions curing cancer, Jerry's reaction is not recorded as shock, disbelief, or any attempt to correct or diminish the moment. The story instead keeps its focus on the warmth between them, treating the friendship itself, rather than the scientific discovery, as the actual point of the scene. That choice mirrors exactly how doofus Rick himself feels about the moment, valuing connection over achievement, and suggests that whatever bond these two have built together matters more to the story than any list of accomplishments either character could put together. Considered together with the earlier section's material, this comic appearance completes a much fuller picture of what the doofus Rick archetype actually represents across the wider Rick and Morty universe. One version, from Dimension J19Z7, gets bullied by his fellow Ricks and dismissed as dim-witted, largely because he lacks the same cruelty and sarcasm the rest of them rely on. A separate version, from Dimension J19 Alpha 7, quietly solves one of humanity's hardest medical problems and shrugs it off entirely in favor of celebrating a small gift from a friend. Neither version behaves the way the show's more famous, more respected Ricks behave, and neither one seems particularly bothered by that difference. If anything, both versions suggest that the qualities other Ricks treat as evidence of stupidity, gentleness, sincerity, and a total lack of interest in proving superiority to anyone might have nothing to do with actual intelligence at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That idea sets up a sharp turn for what comes next, moving away from a character mocked for being too soft and too kind, and toward a completely different kind of Rick. One who spent an entire storyline being feared as one of the coldest, most violent versions of himself anywhere in the multiverse, only for that entire reputation to collapse the moment the truth about him finally came out. Section 6. Evil Rick, the puppet mistaken for a genius villain. Every version of Rick shown across the series carries some kind of reputation, whether earned through real achievement or simply assumed by everyone around him. One version manages something unusual, building a reputation as one of the coldest, most dangerous Ricks ever shown on screen, without any of that reputation actually belonging to him at all. That version goes by the simple label Evil Rick, and his story offers a direct lesson in the difference between appearing brilliant and actually being brilliant. Evil Rick first shows up in the same episode already covered for introducing the Rickest Rick title, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. He appears carrying a distinct facial scar, a detail that sets him apart visually from the standard look most Ricks share, and he travels alongside his own Morty, who wears a black eye patch over one eye. Together, the two of them present themselves as a serious threat from the moment they appear, moving with a confidence and menace that immediately marks Evil Rick as someone dangerous rather than another harmless variant wandering the multiverse. Everything about how this character carries himself supports that first impression. He behaves like a sarcastic, almost gleeful serial killer, someone who clearly enjoys the fear he creates in the people around him. Where the show's main Rick relies on cutting humor and constant complaining to project his own personality, Evil Rick leans into something colder and more theatrical, presenting himself as calm and amused even in the middle of violence. His design reinforces that same impression. Instead of the plain white lab coat nearly every other Rick wears without variation, Evil Rick dresses in a unique combination of red and black, a visual choice that separates him from every other Rick shown up to that point and marks him, at least by appearance, as the most menacing version of the character the audience has encountered so far. At one point during his confrontation with Rick, Evil Rick delivers a line built around the idea that the two of them are not so different from one another, framing himself as a kind of dark mirror standing across from the Rick audiences already know. That kind of comparison usually works best when spoken by a villain who has genuinely walked a similar path to the hero, someone shaped by comparable choices and comparable pain. Coming from Evil Rick, that line carries a very different weight once the truth about him finally comes out, since the choices that shaped him were never actually his own to begin with. Evil Rick's entire storyline in his first appearance builds toward exactly that reveal. He captures Rick with the stated goal of downloading his brain, a plan that positions him as a genius villain pursuing genius-level information through a genius-level method. Nothing about his behavior throughout the episode suggests he is anything other than a smart, capable, dangerous version of Rick operating with his own agenda and his own intelligence behind it. That impression holds right up until Soldier Ricks, cleaning up the aftermath once the fighting ends, discovers something nobody had realized while the danger was still active. Evil Rick was never actually making his own decisions at all. He turns out to be a mindless cyborg, a robotic puppet controlled remotely from somewhere else the entire time. Every menacing choice, every cold line, every calculated move credited to him throughout the episode was never really his. It belonged entirely to the person secretly pulling his strings, revealed to be his own Morty, the same character wearing the black eye patch the whole time, later known across the series as Evil Morty. That eye patch turns out to be the actual mechanism behind everything. Rather than functioning as some kind of simple disguise or cosmetic detail, it worked as the device controlling Evil Rick's every action, letting Evil Morty direct an entire Rick like a puppet on a string, while the rest of the world assumed they were dealing with an unusually dangerous and clever version of Rick acting entirely on his own. Once Evil Morty's role becomes clear to the audience, though not yet to the characters actually living through the story, the entire dynamic of who was really the dangerous one in that relationship flips completely. Evil Rick's death scene reinforces the same idea in a visual, physical way. Once he is finally taken down, part of his head comes apart to reveal sparking wires underneath, confirming outright, in a way impossible to argue with, that nothing organic or independently thinking had ever been steering his body. What looked, moment to moment, like a genius villain making his own calculated choices was mechanical the entire time, a shell built to look convincingly dangerous, while someone else handled the actual thinking from a safe distance. This reveal forces a complete reconsideration of everything Evil Rick appeared to represent throughout his first appearance. His menace, his confidence, his apparent brilliance as a captor and interrogator, none of it reflected any real intelligence belonging to him personally. Every clever move credited to him during the episode actually belonged to Evil Morty, a character the audience would not fully understand as a serious, ongoing threat until years later, once his storyline expanded dramatically across later seasons. Evil Rick's entire reputation as a formidable, dangerous version of Rick turns out to be borrowed entirely from somebody else's mind, worn like a costume, rather than earned through any real thinking of his own. That distinction matters enormously when trying to measure intelligence across different versions of the same character. A Rick who appears sharp, dangerous, and calculating because someone else is controlling his every move is not actually demonstrating any intelligence at all. He is demonstrating how convincingly a puppet can be built and operated, which says everything about the intelligence of whoever built the puppet and nothing about the puppet itself. Evil Rick never solved a problem, never outsmarted an opponent through his own reasoning, and never made a single choice that reflected his own mind working independently. Every decision people assumed belonged to him actually traced back to a 14-year-old boy wearing an eye patch, quietly directing everything from behind the scenes while an entire citadel full of far more experienced, far more established Ricks completely failed to notice what was happening right in front of them. That failure to notice deserves attention on its own. An entire population of Ricks, each one presumably confident in his own intelligence and his own ability to spot danger, spent the whole episode treating Evil Rick as the primary threat while the real architect of everything moved freely among them, unnoticed and unsuspected. Even Rick C-137, someone who spends much of the show insisting on his own superior intelligence compared to nearly everyone around him, never once suspects that the eye patch worn by a Morty might be the actual source of the danger rather than a strange fashion choice. That blind spot says something uncomfortable about how intelligence actually works among these characters. Being clever enough to survive constant danger and outmaneuver enemies does not automatically make someone clever enough to question the assumptions everyone else already accepts without a second thought. Evil Morty's decision to hide behind a puppet in the first place also reveals something about strategy that goes beyond anything Evil Rick himself ever demonstrated. Rather than acting directly and risking exposure, Evil Morty chose to build and operate an entire fake identity. One convincing enough to fool an entire episode's worth of other characters, all without revealing his own involvement until the very end. That kind of patience and long-term planning, willing to let an entire robotic decoy take all the credit and all the blame, while the real mind behind everything stays completely hidden, points toward a level of calculation that goes well beyond simple cleverness. It suggests someone thinking several steps ahead of everyone else in the room, understanding exactly how to use other people's assumptions against them. Considered against the two versions of Doofus Rick covered in the previous sections, Evil Rick's story adds a completely different angle to how intelligence gets faked, hidden, or misjudged throughout the show. Doofus Rick from the television series gets underestimated because he refuses to act the way other Ricks expect intelligence to look. The Doofus Rick from the comics quietly outperforms nearly every other Rick in the show without ever seeking credit for it. Evil Rick represents the exact opposite problem. He gets massively overestimated, treated by everyone around him as a uniquely dangerous, uniquely brilliant threat, precisely because he looks and acts the way people expect a genius villain to look and act, all while possessing no actual mind of his own, generating any of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That contrast points towards something worth exploring more directly, since the entire Citadel that failed to catch what was really happening with Evil Rick is itself built around an official system meant to organize, rank, and judge different versions of Rick by exactly this kind of measure, a governing structure that claims to know which Ricks deserve respect and authority over the rest, without ever proving it can actually spot real intelligence when it matters most. Section 7. The Council of Ricks, Sorting the Smartest, by Committee. Somewhere behind every appearance the Citadel makes across the show sits a governing structure built entirely around organizing and ranking countless versions of the same person. That structure calls itself the Council of Ricks, and its full official title, used by the Citadel's own militia, is the Transdimensional Council of Ricks. Understanding how this council worked, how it fell apart, and what replaced it says more about how the multiverse actually treats intelligence than almost any single character study can manage on its own. Before the council existed in the form fans came to recognize, another leadership group ran things first, though the show gives far less detail about that earlier arrangement compared to the council that eventually took its place. The council itself brought together a group of Ricks considered to stand out from the enormous population living across the Citadel. Among its confirmed members, Rick IV served as the group's spokesman, the Rick who spoke publicly on behalf of the whole body. Alongside him sat other named members, including Quantum Rick and a Rick known as Rick Timonus Sanchez-Aminius, each one presumably selected for some quality that set them apart from the countless ordinary Ricks living outside the council's ranks. Even the group's own badge carried a specific design, built around an upside-down version of a flux capacitor, a small visual detail tying the symbol of governing authority directly back to the technology that made the whole multiverse of Ricks possible in the first place. The very existence of a council, built specifically to sit above and represent all other Ricks, says something important on its own. If every Rick were considered equally intelligent, equally capable, and equally deserving of authority, there would be no reason for a small, exclusive group to claim leadership over the rest. The council's presence confirms that the Citadel operates on the assumption that some Ricks belong at the top and most others do not, with membership apparently working as some kind of stamp of approval, marking a handful of Ricks as more fit to rule than the sprawling population living beneath them. That entire structure did not last. At some point before the events later explored in the Ricklantis mix-up, the Council of Ricks was wiped out entirely, killed by Rick C-137 himself. The very Rick who had spent so much of the earlier part of the show refusing to join any council or governing body in the first place. This detail connects directly back to everything already established about this particular Rick's personality. Rather than accepting a system built to rank and organize Ricks by committee, he chose, at some point, to destroy the entire body claiming that authority, rather than continue living under its rules. With the official council gone, a new system quietly took its place, one operating far less openly than the one it replaced. A group known as the Shadow Council of Ricks assumed real control over the Citadel once the original council had been destroyed, running things from behind the scenes while the public structure of Citadel life continued on without most residents ever fully understanding who was actually pulling the strings. This shift from an open, named council to a hidden shadow council marks an important turn in how the Citadel handled its own claim to organized intelligence. Rather than admitting that its previous ruling body had been destroyed and its authority broken, the Citadel's actual power simply moved underground, continuing to operate exactly as before, just without the same visible accountability. The events explored across the Ricklantis mix-up lay out exactly how deep the Citadel's problems ran by this point, well beyond simply losing its official governing council. The episode opens with Rick and Morty arriving at the Citadel, hoping for nothing more complicated than a quick visit, before heading off to explore Atlantis. Bureaucratic delays hold them up almost immediately, small but telling proof that even something as simple as passing through the Citadel comes wrapped in layers of rules and red tape. Rather than following the main pair through their planned adventure, the episode shifts its attention almost entirely toward the Citadel itself, following several separate storylines happening at once across its streets, offices, and back alleys. The most consequential of these storylines follows a presidential election taking place in the wake of the earlier council's destruction. With no official council left standing, tensions rise sharply between Rick's and Morty's living across the Citadel, particularly around how Mortys have been treated as second-class citizens for a long time, denied the same respect, resources, and authority automatically extended to nearly every Rick. Into that tense atmosphere steps a figure known simply as Candidate Morty, running as part of something called the Morty Party, a political movement built specifically around addressing that long-standing imbalance. Candidate Morty wins over the crowd during a series of public debates, building real momentum behind his campaign. Almost immediately after securing that support, he makes a decision that stuns the people working closest to him. He abruptly fires his own campaign manager, a Morty who had, up to that point, seemed skeptical of the whole campaign despite working on it directly. That firing sets off the chain of events that follows. Campaign manager Morty, now cut loose from the campaign he had been helping build, is later approached quietly by a figure known as Investigator Rick, who hands over secret files containing information about who Candidate Morty really is and what he might actually be planning. Armed with whatever Investigator Rick revealed, campaign manager Morty confronts Candidate Morty directly at his very next public rally, and in that confrontation, he shoots him. That moment could easily have ended the entire storyline right there, removing Candidate Morty from the race entirely. Instead, Candidate Morty survives the shooting, going on to win the election regardless of the attempt on his life. The character behind that campaign, later revealed across the show's much larger mythology to be the same Morty responsible for controlling evil Rick years earlier, secures real, official political power over the entire Citadel, elected fair and square by a population desperate enough for change that they were willing to put their trust behind him. Once elected, the newly installed President Morty wastes no time exposing exactly how little patience he has for the hidden system that had been quietly running things behind the scenes. The Shadow Council of Ricks, the same body that had stepped in once the original, official council was destroyed, meets with him expecting to continue operating as the real power behind whatever public leadership happened to exist above them. Instead, they tell him plainly that he amounts to nothing more than a puppet, someone who holds the title of president without holding any of the actual authority that title is supposed to carry. President Morty responds to that claim with immediate, decisive violence. He has the entire Shadow Council executed, including a specific Rick named Rick D. Sanchez III, removing every last member of the hidden group that had assumed it could control him from behind the scenes. That single act flips the entire power structure of the Citadel upside down. For the first time in the show's exploration of this society, a Morty, not a Rick, holds complete, unchallenged authority over the entire transdimensional population of both. President Morty does not stop at simply eliminating the people who doubted him. He moves quickly to reshape several of the Citadel's core institutions. The police force gets restructured, with an idealistic young officer known as Cop Rick keeping his job under the new system, while a trio of young Mortys, previously assigned to a program known as Standby Mortys, get reassigned instead to work on farms, laboring alongside Rick himself, rather than continuing in whatever role they had held before the change in leadership. President Morty also overhauls the school system used to train and educate young Mortys across the Citadel, changing its curriculum in ways that directly affect students partway through their own education. Even members of the previous council who survive long enough to see this new order taking shape get tested for their loyalty in a chilling, almost theatrical way. One surviving council member, referred to as Garment District Rick, voices the opinion that it does not actually matter who holds the president's chair, since the council itself has always held real control over the Citadel, regardless of whichever figurehead happens to sit above them. President Morty responds to that opinion by holding up a small mirror and asking every Rick present to raise their hand if they agree with what was just said. Those who raise their hands are then quietly assassinated by his own guards, removed the moment they reveal themselves as believers in the old, council-controlled order rather than loyal supporters of the new, Morty-led leadership now in charge. The Ricks who survive that test, now thoroughly terrified, are asked directly whether they will obey going forward, and every one of them agrees. Everything that follows plays out like the closing scene of an entirely successful takeover. New banners get put up across the Citadel, replacing whatever symbols represented the old order. Cop Rick returns to his usual duties under the new rules. The reassigned Mortys begin their new work harvesting crops out on the farms. Meanwhile, the bodies of the executed council members get quietly dragged away into airlock chambers, cleared out of sight as the new administration settles into place. President Morty, reflecting privately on everything that just happened, considers delivering some kind of grand, calculated speech about order, unity, and power to mark the occasion, before ultimately choosing to move forward without giving one at all, content to let his actions speak for themselves rather than dressing the moment up with speeches. Running alongside this larger political storyline, the episode follows several smaller plots that reveal just how deeply corrupt and unequal life across the Citadel had already become, long before any of this political upheaval took place. One storyline follows an idealistic rookie officer, Cop Rick, partnered with a jaded, corrupt Cop Morty, who openly harbors negative feelings toward Mortys despite being one himself. Together, the mismatched pair get sent to investigate a rundown section of the Citadel known as Mortytown, home to Mortys living without any Rick attached to care for them, treated as an underclass compared to the rest of Citadel society. While investigating a suspected drug operation there, Cop Rick ends up killing a member of a local gang called the Mortytown Locos in self-defense. Rather than treating that moment as a tragedy worth pausing over, Cop Morty comforts his partner, and the two begin to genuinely bond over the encounter. That bond does not last long. Cop Morty later detonates the very building they had just cleared, destroying it completely with the arrested gang members still trapped inside, revealing a far darker, more careless side to his character than his earlier warmth toward Cop Rick suggested. The two eventually meet with a local crime boss known as Big Morty, who offers Cop Rick a bribe, the same kind of bribe Cop Morty himself had apparently already accepted without telling his partner. Cop Rick refuses the offer outright, setting off a violent standoff. In the chaos that follows, Cop Morty voices open regret over ever leaving behind whatever ordinary life he once had in exchange for a career on the Citadel, before killing Big Morty and then turning his weapon on his own partner. Cop Rick manages to kill Cop Morty first and survives, surrendering himself afterward to the officers who arrive on the scene, commenting bitterly on just how destructive Ricks tend to be toward the Mortys unlucky enough to end up working alongside them. A separate storyline follows a Rick living and working inside a wafer factory located within the Citadel, the same figure whose home dimension was identified earlier as J22, a Rick who eventually kills his own supervisor and takes the factory hostage rather than continue enduring conditions there. Connected to that same storyline, a SWAT team made up of fellow Ricks attempts to trick this factory worker Rick using a sabotaged portal device, an operation that ultimately leads to the death of a separate character known as Simple Rick. Before that fatal trick plays out, the factory worker Rick manages to free Simple Rick and send him through a portal, an act suggesting some level of loyalty or shared grievance existing between workers trapped inside the Citadel's lower economic tiers, standing in stark contrast to the Council and Shadow Council members occupying positions of comfort and authority far above them. Yet another storyline follows a small group of Mortys nearing graduation from a school built specifically to train and educate young Mortys across the Citadel. Rather than simply finishing their studies and stepping into whatever ordinary life waits for them afterward, this group sets out instead to track down something spoken about almost like a piece of local legend, a device known across the Citadel as the Wishing Portal, said to be capable of granting whoever finds it whatever they wish for. Taken together, these separate storylines paint a picture of Citadel life built on exactly the same problems found in ordinary human societies, despite every resident technically being some version of the same brilliant scientist. Workers get exploited and underpaid. Police accept bribes and cause more harm than the crimes they claim to be solving. An entire underclass of Mortys lives without proper support or protection. A secretive group of powerful Ricks manipulates the official system from the shadows, confident that whoever holds the visible title of leadership will always answer to them in the end. None of this reflects a society built around genuine, well-organized intelligence. It reflects a society where a handful of Ricks convince themselves and everyone around them that ranking, controlling, and profiting off the rest counted as wisdom, right up until a single Morty proved capable of outmaneuvering every one of them at once. That single fact carries enormous weight once placed next to everything the Council of Ricks was originally built to represent. An entire governing body made up specifically of Ricks, considered exceptional enough to rule over countless other versions of themselves, gets replaced, almost effortlessly, by one Morty willing to survive an assassination attempt, win a real election, and then execute anyone still clinging to the old order the moment they revealed themselves as a threat. Whatever standard the Council used to select its own members clearly said nothing about who would actually prove capable of holding real power once tested directly. The society built to prove Ricks belonged at the top of their own multiverse ended up conquered by exactly the group it had spent so long treating as beneath them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Among all the separate storylines running through this one episode, the factory worker from Dimension J22 stands out as worth returning to on his own terms, since his path from ordinary Citadel laborer to a man willing to take violent action against the system holding him down says something specific about what happens when a Rick's own intelligence gets buried under conditions nobody bothered to design fairly in the first place. Section 8. Rick J22, a Rick whose smarts went nowhere. Not every Rick in the Citadel gets a chance to prove what he can do. Somewhere among the countless factory floors, office buildings, and back rooms built to keep the Citadel of Ricks running day to day, one particular worker's story lays out, in painfully clear terms, what happens when raw intelligence gets trapped inside a system that has no interest in recognizing it. That worker is Rick Sanchez J22, and his story turns the entire question of measuring a Rick's smarts completely on its head. Rick J22 worked at a place called Simple Rick's Wafer Cookie Factory, a facility built around one of the strangest and most disturbing pieces of Citadel infrastructure the show ever presents. The wafers produced there were flavored using positive neurochemicals, essentially happy memories, pulled directly from a Rick known as Simple Rick, who spent his existence hooked into the machinery that powered the entire operation. Rather than relying on ordinary ingredients, the factory ran on a captured version of contentment itself, extracted from one specific Rick and turned into a consumer product sold across the Citadel. Rick J22 spent 15 years working on that factory's assembly line, first as a regular worker and later as part of a section known as the Flavor Core, the area of the facility connected most directly to the machinery, keeping Simple Rick's harvested happiness flowing into the product. 15 years is an extraordinarily long stretch of time to spend doing the same repetitive work, especially for a character built from the same base intelligence as every other Rick shown across the entire series. J22 held on to hope that all those years of dedication would eventually be rewarded, watching for any opportunity to move up into a better position within the factory's hierarchy. That opportunity finally seemed to arrive when his supervisor announced a promotion to the position of regional manager, a move that opened up the supervisor role directly beneath it. Given how long J22 had already put into the job, this seemed like the obvious moment for his patience to finally pay off. Instead, the factory handed the supervisor position to a completely different Rick, one known across the Citadel as Cool Rick, officially designated K83, a worker who had only recently joined the company compared to J22's 15 years of steady labor. Watching a newcomer leapfrog past him into the exact position he had been waiting years to earn left J22 bitter and disillusioned, deepening a frustration that had clearly been building inside him long before that specific moment. Around this same stretch of time, the ongoing presidential campaign taking place across the Citadel intersected directly with J-22's situation in a way that mattered enormously. Candidate Morty, the same figure whose campaign and eventual election was covered in the previous section, used factory conditions like the ones J-22 lived through as a direct talking point during a public campaign speech. He described a system where Ricks work for a fraction of what their bosses earn, despite being identical to those same bosses and sharing the exact same intelligence. That single line captures, in plain terms, the entire injustice sitting underneath J-22's story. Nothing about his mind separated him from the Ricks running the factory above him, or from any other version of Rick living comfortably elsewhere across the Citadel. The only difference dividing them was the position each one happened to occupy inside a system that had nothing to do with actual ability. Hearing that unfairness spoken about openly during a campaign speech, combined with watching a newer employee take the promotion he had waited 15 years to receive, pushed J-22 past his breaking point. He tore his personal assembly machine apart, abandoning the workstation he had spent so much of his life standing at, and made his way upstairs to confront the supervisor directly. Once there, he killed his former supervisor outright, an act of violence that immediately shifted his entire situation from a frustrated worker to a wanted criminal. In the immediate aftermath, J-22 seemed to register the weight of what he had just done, reacting with genuine shock at his own actions, before the factory's alarms began sounding and he made a run for the flavor core, the section of the building most directly tied to the machinery, keeping the whole operation running. Once inside the flavor core, J-22 sealed himself in and took the unconscious, essentially helpless Simple Rick hostage, using him as leverage against the SWAT team of Ricks that quickly arrived to handle the crisis. His demand was specific and carefully thought through, an unregistered, completely untraceable portal gun, a device that would let him escape the Citadel entirely without leaving any way for authorities to follow him afterward. That single demand reveals something important about how J-22's mind was actually working underneath the chaos of the moment. Rather than simply lashing out blindly, he understood exactly what kind of escape route would actually protect him, choosing a specific, carefully considered tool rather than grabbing at whatever weapon or vehicle happened to be closest. The SWAT team agreed to his demand, but secretly rigged the portal device before handing it over, locking its coordinates to a place known as the Blender Dimension rather than wherever J-22 actually intended to escape to. Trusting that his demand had been honored, J-22 freed Simple Rick, reassuring the disoriented, barely conscious man that everything would be fine before sending him through the rigged portal instead of using it to escape himself. That choice, freeing his hostage and sending him through the device first, rather than stepping through it personally, ended up costing Simple Rick his life, since the portal led directly into the Blender Dimension rather than anywhere safe. In the moment right after this happens, J-22 remarks that the whole situation amounts to the oldest trick in the book, a line that suggests he may have suspected some kind of deception from the SWAT team all along. At the same time, his reaction in that same moment reads as genuine shock once he realizes what actually happened to Simple Rick, leaving real uncertainty over whether he saw the trick coming and gambled anyway, or whether his comment was simply bitter recognition arriving a moment too late to matter. Either way, the outcome remained the same. Simple Rick, the man whose entire captured happiness had been powering the factory this whole time, ended up dead, killed by a trick meant to end J-22's standoff rather than by anything J-22 directly intended. Just as the SWAT team moved to finally apprehend J-22 following Simple Rick's death, they were stopped by an unexpected figure, the actual owner of the factory, a powerful Rick known as Rick D. Sanchez III. Rather than punishing J-22 for everything that had just happened, including a murder and a hostage situation that ended in another death, Sanchez III instead praised him for his courage, publicly framing the entire violent outburst as something admirable rather than criminal. He then set J-22 free, presenting him with a lavish reward, a fancy vehicle meant to celebrate him as something like a working-class hero who had stood up against an unfair system. For a brief moment, J-22 appeared overwhelmed with genuine emotion, believing that everything he had endured, the years of frustration, the denied promotion, the violence he had just committed, had finally led to real recognition and reward. That belief did not survive contact with what Sanchez III actually intended. Rather than letting J-22 enjoy any real freedom, Sanchez III stunned him the moment his guard was down, and rather than releasing him afterward, connected him directly into the same kind of machinery that had once relied on Simple Rick, using J22's own overwhelming happiness in that exact moment as the new source of positive feeling needed to keep the factory's wafer flavoring running. That final twist reframes everything that came before it. J22's entire violent rebellion, born out of years of legitimate frustration over being passed over despite his experience and equal intelligence, ended not with justice or freedom, but with him becoming the exact same kind of captured, harvested resource that simple Rick had been before him. The factory did not need to defeat him through force or punish him through prison. It simply needed to wait for one moment of genuine, overwhelming joy, and then trap him inside that emotion permanently, turning his brief taste of recognition into a life sentence spent generating flavor for the very product he used to help manufacture on the assembly line. Considered as a case study in intelligence, J22's story stands apart from every other Rick covered in earlier sections. He was never mocked as less capable the way Doofus Rick was. He was never underestimated because of a gentle personality or a lack of sarcasm. Every account of his situation confirms he possessed the exact same intelligence, the exact same knowledge, and the exact same capability as every higher-ranking Rick standing above him in the factory's hierarchy. His failure to rise, his 15 years spent doing repetitive labor while newer employees leapfrogged past him, had nothing to do with any gap in ability. It came entirely from a system built to keep certain Ricks locked in place regardless of what they were actually capable of, treating years of loyal, competent labor as worth less than whatever arbitrary factor determined who got promoted instead. His eventual act of violence, carefully planned enough to include a specific demand for an untraceable escape route, shows a mind still working through real strategy even in a moment of complete desperation. That same mind, sharp enough to think through an escape plan under extreme pressure, was not enough to protect him from being manipulated one final time, first through a rigged portal that killed his hostage, and then through a staged reward that turned his own happiness into the very trap he had just tried so hard to escape. Being just as smart as every Rick above him never translated into actually getting free. It simply meant the system found a slightly more elaborate way to keep him contained. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That entire arc, intelligence equal to everyone else, and a fate defined entirely by circumstance rather than capability, connects directly to the same weapon already introduced earlier in this analysis. The device built by the one Rick whose intelligence actually did translate into total, unmatched power across the entire multiverse. A contrast worth returning to directly as the story moves toward its final confrontation and the moment that weapon's true danger got permanently erased for good. Section 9. The Omega Device, the ultimate test of Rick-level genius. The weapon capable of erasing an entire person across every version of reality did not disappear the moment its original creator died. Its story continued well past Rick Prime's death, passing into new hands, getting rebuilt, and eventually becoming the setting for what may be the single cleverest move any version of Rick pulls off across the entire series. Following that weapon's path from the final moments of Unmortrican through to its permanent destruction later on reveals exactly what real, tested genius looks like when everything is on the line. During the closing fight of Unmortrican, once both Morty and Rick had been knocked unconscious from the battle, evil Morty found a way to gain the upper hand over Rick Prime without relying on brute force. He swapped outfits with Morty and faked a reunion with Rick Prime, presenting himself as Rick Prime's original biological grandson, finally reconnecting with him. That deception worked well enough to catch Rick Prime off guard, letting evil Morty drag him into another room, restrain him, and scan directly into his mind. Before pulling anything else from that scan, evil Morty made sure to erase Rick Prime's backup clones first, closing off any chance that Rick Prime could ever return through some hidden copy of himself elsewhere. Only after securing that outcome did evil Morty locate and download the full schematics needed to build the Omega device, taking for himself the exact blueprint behind the most destructive weapon in the entire multiverse. By the time Rick emerged from his final confrontation with Rick Prime, covered in his enemy's blood, having finally gotten the revenge he spent decades chasing, evil Morty had already disabled the Omega device sitting nearby. Watching Rick in that moment, evil Morty noted that revenge did not seem to have brought him any real satisfaction, an observation Rick did not deny. Evil Morty then reminded Rick directly that he now possessed the means to rebuild the same weapon that had just been used to kill Rick Prime, but made clear he had no plans to actually use it, at least for the time being. His reasoning was straightforward. A weapon of that magnitude would only invite the same kind of relentless pursuit that had defined Rick Prime's entire life, the same kind of enemies chasing him forever afterward, described specifically as the risk of facing vengeful summers seeking payback down the line. Evil Morty said plainly that he simply wanted to be left alone, not saddled with the endless conflict that came attached to owning something so powerful. He then admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that something about Rick struck him as different compared to every other version of Rick he had encountered before. That restraint did not last. Sometime between the end of Unmortrican and the beginning of the next major chapter in this story, the Season 9 premiere titled There's Something About Morty, Evil Morty changed his mind and rebuilt the Omega device after all. Rather than using it right away for destruction, he turned it into the ultimate form of leverage, rigging it with a mechanism designed to trigger automatically if he were ever seriously harmed. Inside that rebuilt device, Evil Morty had trapped versions of Rick, Beth, Jerry, and Summer, pulled from what gets described as an ideal hostage dimension, meaning that any move made against him would permanently erase every single version of the entire Smith family from existence, across all of infinite reality at once. That kind of leverage left almost no room for resistance. Any attempt to fight back, outsmart him, or simply walk away carried the risk of wiping out Rick's entire family everywhere they had ever existed, a threat far more absolute than anything even Rick Prime had managed to hold over anyone during his own reign of terror. Faced with that threat, Rick found himself forced into the position of reluctant partner, blackmailed into helping Evil Morty defend the central finite curve against a dangerous, universe-consuming threat known as the Collective. Working alongside someone he clearly despised, Rick nonetheless carried out the missions Evil Morty demanded of him, all while the family back home remained completely unaware of what was actually happening. At one point during this uneasy partnership, Rick showed Evil Morty a piece of his own time travel technology, an act of trust or perhaps simple necessity given the situation, which prompted Evil Morty to build his own device based on the same idea, something he called a time stopper. Eventually, when the threat posed by the Collective grew serious enough that Evil Morty needed Rick's help once again, Morty Prime discovered the secret arrangement his grandfather had been hiding, learning that Rick had been quietly communicating with Evil Morty for some time. Despite Rick's mild resistance to the idea, Morty insisted on joining the mission directly, unwilling to be left out of whatever dangerous partnership his grandfather had gotten pulled into. Together, the three of them worked through the confrontation with the Collective, relying on a mix of advanced technology and coordinated combat to overcome the threat. Once the danger had passed, the trio ended up sharing a meal together at a diner, a strange, almost domestic scene given everything that had led up to it. During that meal, Evil Morty made a point of rubbing his growing partnership with Rick directly in Morty's face, clearly enjoying the discomfort it caused. Rick, in turn, insisted there was nothing meaningful behind his cooperation with Evil Morty, framing the entire arrangement as something forced on him through blackmail, rather than any kind of genuine alliance. That exchange grew tense enough that Rick and Morty eventually stormed off from the diner in frustration, leaving Evil Morty behind. What looked, on the surface, like an ordinary flash of family tension turned out to be exactly the opening Rick had been quietly waiting for. Rather than reacting purely out of anger or annoyance, Rick had used his own irritation, genuine as it was, to set up a specific opportunity. While still at the diner, he asked Evil Morty for permission to step away to use the bathroom, correctly predicting that Evil Morty, drawn to any chance to be alone with Morty and needle him further about the strange bond forming between himself and Rick, would allow it without a second thought. That single request, small and easy to overlook, gave Rick exactly the window he needed. Rather than actually using the bathroom, Rick slipped away entirely, made his way to Evil Morty's lair while his rival remained distracted, and destroyed the rebuilt Omega device sitting inside it. The full brilliance of that moment only becomes clear once the details behind it come out. Rick had not simply destroyed the physical device sitting in front of him. He had, at some earlier point during his forced partnership with Evil Morty, secretly hidden the complete blueprints needed to rebuild the Omega device inside the device itself. That single choice meant that the moment the physical Omega device was destroyed, the schematics required to ever build another one vanished right along with it, erased from existence in exactly the same permanent, total way the weapon itself was designed to erase any person it targeted. Rick had turned the Omega device's own defining power, the ability to wipe something out of existence entirely rather than merely destroying one copy of it, against the weapon's own knowledge of how to exist at all. When Evil Morty eventually returned to his lair, he found it destroyed, the weapon he had been using as absolute leverage over Rick and his entire family gone completely, along with any possibility of rebuilding it ever again. Rick, Rather than hiding what he had done, openly boasted about the accomplishment. Once the confrontation that followed made it clear the plan had worked. He pointed out that Evil Morty's own overconfidence, built from years spent always holding the advantage over every other Rick and every other Morty he had ever encountered, had made him complacent enough to be outmaneuvered by someone he assumed he had fully under control. Being used to total dominance over everyone around him left Evil Morty unprepared for the possibility that the person he was blackmailing might be quietly working several steps ahead the entire time. Rick did not treat this victory as the end of the danger, however. Even with the weapon destroyed and its blueprints erased, he understood clearly that Evil Morty, now robbed of his greatest source of leverage and deeply humiliated by having been outsmarted so completely, would come looking for revenge. Rather than assuming the fight was over, Rick immediately began preparing for the confrontation he knew was still coming. He transported the entire Smith family house into a bunker dimension he had built specifically to protect them, taking real, immediate action to shield his family from the retaliation he expected. It was also at this point that Rick finally told the rest of the family the truth about who Evil Morty actually was, along with details about the technology Evil Morty possessed and whatever weaknesses might exist that could eventually be used against him, information Beth, Jerry, and Summer had never been given before this moment. That revelation did not sit well with Morty once he pieced together exactly how long this secret arrangement between his grandfather and Evil Morty had actually been going on. When Rick tried to brush off a question rather than answering it directly, Morty grew suspicious enough to physically wrestle his grandfather's phone away from him, discovering in the process that Rick had been quietly texting Evil Morty for a considerable stretch of time, keeping the entire arrangement hidden even from the one family member who had already been directly involved in some of the missions tied to it. That discovery left Morty furious, forced to reconcile everything he thought he understood about his grandfather's relationship with the very villain who had once controlled a puppet Rick and orchestrated so much of the chaos surrounding their family. Looking at this entire sequence as a single, complete test of intelligence, it stands apart from nearly everything covered earlier in this analysis. Rick Prime demonstrated genius through invention and through decades of successfully evading capture. Doofus Rick demonstrated an entirely different kind of unrecognized capability hidden behind a personality nobody bothered respecting. Evil Rick demonstrated the danger of mistaking borrowed intelligence for real intelligence. J22 demonstrated how equal ability can be trapped and wasted by unfair circumstances outside of anyone's control. What Rick accomplishes here goes further than any of those examples, because it involves outsmarting an opponent who already held every possible advantage, complete leverage over Rick's entire family, superior confidence built from years of dominance, and full awareness that he was dealing with a dangerous and capable adversary. Pulling off a plan like this required patience, stretching across an extended partnership, playing along convincingly enough that Evil Morty never suspected anything beyond ordinary reluctant cooperation, all while secretly preparing the exact mechanism needed to end the entire threat permanently. It required understanding Evil Morty's personality well enough to predict precisely how he would react to a small, seemingly harmless request at exactly the right moment. And it required a level of foresight rare even among Ricks, hiding the solution to a future problem inside the problem itself long before that solution would ever actually be needed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That combination of patience, psychological insight, and long-range planning offers the clearest possible answer to a question that has been building across every section covered so far: what it actually looks like when a Rick's intelligence gets tested against the highest possible stakes and comes out completely successful on the other side. Setting up one final task, pulling every version of Rick covered throughout this entire analysis together into a single, complete picture of what being smart, being underestimated, being manipulated, and being outmatched actually mean across the full, sprawling reach of the multiverse. Section 10. Ranking the multiverse. What smartest Rick really measures every version of Rick and every institution built around them, covered across this analysis, forms one connected picture, once placed side by side. What began as a simple question, figuring out how smart each version of this character actually is, ends up revealing something much bigger about how intelligence gets recognized, hidden, tested, and sometimes completely wasted across an entire multiverse, built from the same basic mind, repeated over and over again. Rick C-137 opened this entire investigation, and his story showed how confusing even a basic starting point can be. For years, both the audience and the characters themselves believed a simple fact that turned out to be wrong, that the dimension shown in the earliest episodes was his true home. That mistake, eventually corrected through Solarix, revealed a far more complicated picture. A Rick who lost his real wife and daughter as a young child in his own family, who lived through years of interrogation lies and half-true stories before the full picture ever came out, and who eventually chose to settle inside a borrowed family in a completely different dimension, hoping to lure the man responsible for his loss back into reach. None of that reflects the image most people carry of Rick as a supremely confident genius who always knows exactly what is happening around him. It shows someone shaped entirely by grief, spending decades building an identity around chasing one specific enemy, all while keeping the truth about his own past hidden even from the family he chose to live with. Rick Prime, by contrast, showed what unchecked, undiluted brilliance actually looks like when nothing holds it back. He solved interdimensional travel completely alone, without guidance from anyone else, becoming the first Rick anywhere to crack a problem every other version of the character would eventually rely on. He then abandoned the family he built, rather than staying, choosing discovery over connection in a way almost no other Rick in the entire show ever manages so cleanly. His later invention, the Omega device, proved capable of erasing an entire person across all of infinite reality at once, a level of destructive capability nothing else in the franchise ever matches. Decades of pursuit from Rick C-137 never once caught him, not because Rick C-137 lacked intelligence, but because Rick Prime consistently proved sharper, more careful, and more thorough at covering his own tracks. Even in his final moments, defiant and mocking right up until his death, he demonstrated a mind that never once doubted its own superiority, right until the exact instant that superiority finally ran out. Set directly against Rick Prime's cold brilliance, Doofus Rick from the television series offered a completely different measure of intelligence, one built around warmth rather than cleverness. Mocked openly by the other Ricks around him, crying when they belittled his friendship with Jerry, and disparagingly nicknamed for lacking the sharp, sarcastic edge every other Rick relies on constantly, Doofus Rick never once demonstrated any actual failure of capability. He survived events that killed enormous numbers of far more respected Ricks. He maintained his own home dimension. He built a real, lasting friendship with someone the rest of his own family barely bothers to respect. Everything that earned him his nickname traced back to personality rather than any genuine gap in ability, exposing something uncomfortable about how the Ricks around him actually measure worth. The second version of Doofus Rick, introduced through the comic series and living in a completely separate dimension, confirmed that suspicion directly. Casually mentioning that he had cured cancer just the previous week, in the same breath as complimenting a homemade t-shirt, this version of the character quietly accomplished something almost no other Rick across the entire franchise is ever shown achieving, and then treated a small act of friendship as more meaningful than that achievement. If intelligence among Ricks really depended on solving impossible problems, this gentle, overlooked character type solved one of the hardest problems humanity has ever faced, all while continuing to prioritize connection over recognition, standing in direct contrast to how nearly every other Rick in the show handles success. Evil Rick told a very different story, one built around the danger of assuming intelligence from appearance alone. Wearing a distinct facial scar, dressed in his own unique red and black outfit, and behaving with a cold, theatrical menace, he convinced an entire episode's worth of characters that he was operating as a genuinely dangerous, independently thinking version of Rick. The eventual reveal, sparking wires visible after his death, confirmed that nothing about him had ever been real. Every clever, threatening choice credited to him actually belonged to Evil Morty, quietly controlling him through an eye patch the entire time. That reveal exposed a completely different failure mode than the one facing Doofus Rick. Where Doofus Rick got underestimated despite real ability, Evil Rick got wildly overestimated despite having no independent mind of his own at all, fooling an entire citadel full of presumably intelligent Ricks who never once thought to question what was really happening in front of them. The Council of Ricks and the entire governing structure, built around organizing the citadel, added an institutional layer to this same question. An official body made up specifically of Ricks, considered exceptional enough to rule over countless other versions of themselves, eventually got wiped out entirely by Rick C-137, only to be replaced by a hidden shadow council operating behind the scenes without most residents ever fully realizing who actually held real power. That entire structure, built around the assumption that some Ricks naturally deserved authority over the rest, ultimately fell to a single Morty, someone the Citadel's own leadership had spent years treating as beneath serious consideration. An election, an assassination attempt survived, and a swift, ruthless purge of the very council that assumed it could control him from the shadows proved that whatever standard the Citadel used to select its own leadership said nothing reliable about who would actually hold power once genuinely tested. Rick J22 completed the picture of how badly a fair, working system can fail even the most capable Ricks. Explicitly described as just as smart as every Rick standing above him in the factory hierarchy, sharing the same knowledge and the same intelligence as his supervisors, J22 spent 15 years working the same repetitive job, passed over for promotion in favor of a newer employee despite his years of dedication. His eventual violent rebellion, carefully planned enough to include a specific demand for an untraceable escape route, showed real strategic thinking even under extreme pressure. That same intelligence proved useless against a system built to exploit rather than recognize it, ending with him permanently trapped inside the very machinery he once operated. His own overwhelming happiness harvested the same way simple Ricks had been before him. Nothing about his story involved a lack of ability. Everything about it involved a structure with no interest in rewarding ability fairly in the first place. Finally, the story of the Omega device's ultimate destruction offered the clearest possible demonstration of intelligence tested against the highest imaginable stakes and succeeding completely. Facing an opponent who held every conceivable advantage, complete leverage over his entire family, years of unbroken dominance over every other Rick and Morty he had ever encountered, and full awareness that Rick was dangerous, Rick still found a way to win. He played along with blackmail long enough to avoid suspicion, understood his opponent's personality well enough to predict exactly how a small request would be received, and had quietly hidden the exact solution to the entire threat inside the weapon itself long before that solution was ever needed. Evil Morty's own overconfidence, built from years of assuming total control over everyone around him, became the exact weakness Rick exploited to end the danger for good. Taken together, these stories point toward a conclusion that goes beyond simply picking one Rick as the smartest. Raw intelligence, based on everything covered across every one of these examples, appears to be shared almost equally across nearly every version of the character. Rick Prime, Rick C-137, Doofus Rick in both his forms, J-22, and even the puppet mistaken for a genius villain all share the exact same underlying mind, the same base capability that defines what it means to be a Rick in the first place. What actually separates them from one another has far less to do with how smart any individual version happens to be, and far more to do with what each one chooses to do with that intelligence, what circumstances surround them, and how the people around them choose to judge them. Rick Prime turned his brilliance toward abandonment, control, and eventually a weapon capable of erasing entire lives from existence, becoming the single most feared figure in the whole multiverse, specifically because he never let anything, family included, stand between himself and total power. Rick C-137 turned that same underlying capability toward one singular, decades-long pursuit of revenge, carrying real intelligence forward through grief rather than through cold detachment, ultimately proving sharp enough to outlast and defeat the very man who had spent his whole life outsmarting him. Doofus Rick, in both his forms, showed that the exact same intelligence, when paired with kindness instead of cruelty, gets dismissed by other Ricks not because it fails to measure up, but because it refuses to perform the way they expect intelligence to look. Evil Rick showed how easily a total absence of independent thought can be mistaken for genius, so long as the right costume and the right menace get attached to it. The Council of Ricks and the Citadel's entire governing system showed that claiming authority over who counts as smart enough to rule proves nothing about who will actually hold power once real pressure arrives. J-22 showed that equal intelligence guarantees nothing when the system surrounding it has no interest in recognizing fairness. And the final defeat of the Omega device showed exactly what happens when patience, careful planning, and a clear read on another person's weaknesses come together at precisely the right moment, proving decisively that the sharpest mind in any given room is not always the loudest, the most feared, or the most obviously in control. Across every one of these stories, real intelligence and reputation for intelligence turn out to be two completely separate things. Some Ricks earn fear and respect without ever demonstrating real independent thought behind it. Others get mocked and dismissed despite quietly accomplishing more than almost anyone gives them credit for. Somewhere between total, catastrophic misuse of genius and a full life spent trapped inside a system too unfair to notice genuine talent, this entire multiverse of identical minds ends up sorted not by how smart each version actually is, but by what each one chooses to build with that intelligence, who happens to be watching when they build it, and whether anyone around them is paying close enough attention to notice the difference between a mind working quietly in the background and one simply performing the part everyone already expects it to play. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.